Following the victory of the Valar against Morgoth in the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age, the world was forever changed, with the lands of Beleriand submerged beneath the waves, while the island of Elena was raised in the middle of the Sea of Belegir. Though the first Dark Lord was defeated and his spirit banished from the world, it came at a heavy cost, with many dwarves, elves, and men lost in the fighting and its aftermath. The surviving dwarves from the Firebeard and Broadbeam clans abandoned the ruins of Belegost and Nogrod in the Blue Mountains to join Durin's folk in Khazad Dûm, while the Noldor, Sindar, and Green Elves settled in the newly formed kingdom of Lindon under Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor. Through the port city of Mithlond, ruled by Círdan, other elves sailed west and returned to Valinor, their ancient home in the Undying Lands. This wondrous, enchanted region in the continent of Aman was home to the powerful Valar and Maiar, beings older than the world itself, and flowed with a magical energy that made it a paradise for the elves. Yet some preferred to stay in Middle-earth and live within their own realms, with the more adventurous among them leaving the kingdom of Lindon to explore further east until coming into contact with their ancient kinsmen, the Sylvan Elves, descended from those Teleri who long ago chose to abandon the great journey to Valinor, instead populating the lands east of the Misty Mountains. These Teleri then became Nandor, tribal forest dwellers who mixed with the Avari of the Far East, and in time were called Silvan, sharing not only ancient kinship with the Noldor and Sindar, but also a more direct connection to the Green Elves of Lindon, who were among the Nandor that remained behind, only to later follow their leader Denethor in finally crossing over the mountains to explore the lands beyond, until settling in Beleriand. Recognizing their own kind, the Silvan welcomed them with open arms, learning all they could from the more advanced elves of the West and accepting them as rulers, with Amdir becoming king of Lothlorien and Orofur ruling the woodland realm further north, both Sindar elves who lived in Doriath during the First Age. While the elves and dwarves resettled in Middle-earth, the human tribes of the Edain, who fought for the Valar against Morgoth, were rewarded with longer lifespans and the island of Elena, where they founded the kingdom of Numenor. Ruled by Elros, the half-elven son of a powerful noble bloodline, he gave up the chance to live as an immortal elf to instead become a mortal man, founding a royal dynasty whose descendants lived even longer than their fellow Numenorians, ruling over them for thousands of years to come. When Elros, called Tar Miniatur, at last died in the year 442, his eldest son Tar Vardamir inherited the scepter, but he was already advanced in years, with no interest in ruling, and so abdicated in favor of his son, Tar Amandil. Amandil ruled until the year 590, when he abdicated for his son, Tar Elendil, whose reign saw the Numenorians sail beyond their waters to rediscover and explore Middle-earth. In the year 740, Elendil, now well into his elder years, abdicated in favor of his firstborn son, Tar Meneldur, who was the third-born overall, with his two older sisters passed over because the law at the time forbid women from ruling. Nevertheless, Elendil's firstborn child, Silmarien, went on to have a tremendous impact on the history of their people, as she married the nobleman Elatan and had a son, Valandil, inspiring her father the king to create the title Lord of Andunier and bestow it on the child. As a result, the Lord of Andunier and his descendants became one of the most prominent noble families on the island, who would ultimately preserve the legacy of their people into the Third Age and beyond. Under Tar Elendil, as well as his son Tar Meneldur, Numenor further explored Middle-earth, and through their friendship with the elves, were contacted by the tribes of their ancient kin, who came to be known as the Middlemen, descendants of the Atanatari, who did not pass beyond the Blue Mountains during the human migration west. Since most Numenorians shared common ancestry with the Middlemen through the houses of Beor and Marak, they recognized the similarities between the speech of these more primitive people with their own Adunaik, and so established friendly relations, trading and intermixing with them until their languages combined to create Westron, the common speech of the Third Age. Unfortunately, the Numenorians did not feel this same camaraderie with all the tribes they encountered, as the descendants of the Haladin spoke a different language entirely, and so were not counted as middlemen and treated with hostility. Back on Numenor, the king's eldest son, Aldarion, did his duty and married the woman Erendis to produce a daughter, Aranel. Yet while Erendis loved her husband in the beginning, his true love was the sea, and she came to resent him for spending nearly all his time away. Eventually, she left him and took their daughter to her family's homeland, but when her husband returned from his latest adventure, he demanded Arenelle be returned. Grudgingly, she obeyed his command, but did not return to his side until years later when she traveled to see him as he returned from his final voyage, only to perish in water before he arrived. In the year 884 of the Second Age, Meneldur abdicated and his son Eldarion took the throne. Estranged from his wife and without a male heir, the king changed the law so his daughter Arenelle could succeed him, and when he abdicated in 1075, she rose to become Tar Ankalime, the first queen of Numenor. Unfortunately, the tumultuous relationship of her parents greatly influenced her outlook on marriage, leaving her to arrange a loveless political wedding with the nobleman Holokar, done only to produce an heir, their son Anarion, after which they lived entirely separate lives. In later life, her disdain for marriage remained, and she forbid her granddaughters from being wed. In the year 1280, Ankalime abdicated in favor of her son Tar Anarion, and he did the same in 1394 for his third-born child Surion, as his two elder daughters refused the crown. Surion ruled until 1566, when he abdicated for his daughter Tar Telperion, the second ever queen of Numenor. While the descendants of the Edain thrived on their faraway island, the peoples of Middle-earth struggled against a rising threat, as Sauron, the Maiar spirit who once served as a lieutenant of Morgoth, survived their defeat in the War of Wrath, and 500 years later began to spread his influence and grow his power. By the year 1000, Sauron settled in Mordor and started building the Tower of Barad-dûr. Determined to rule over the continent, Sauron grew his strength, breeding armies of orcs and trolls, as well as recruiting human warriors from the Easterlings and Haradrim, men he tricked, coerced, or corrupted into his service. Yet the second Dark Lord knew that armies alone might not bring him victory, and so he used cunning, manipulation, and subterfuge to help weaken and undermine his enemies. The elves, meanwhile, continued to settle the west, founding the realm of Eregion in the year 750, led by Galadriel, the Lady of Light, and her husband Celeborn, until they left in 1350 to live in Lothlorien further east. After their departure, Celebrimbor took power, renowned for his skill as a smith, and his ancestry as the grandson of Feanor, one of the most famous and powerful elves to ever live. Celebrimbor's love of crafting was shared by his people, and they became unique among the elves by developing amicable relations with the dwarves of Durin's folk, bonding over their shared love of smithwork and teaching each other their skills. Yet Eregion soon came under threat when Sauron appeared before them, posing as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, an envoy from the Vala Aule sent to teach them secret crafting knowledge. Though some did not trust him, many of those within Eregion were eager to learn this secret knowledge, and with Anatar's encouragement, they used their new skills to craft 16 magical rings, while another 3 were forged exclusively by their leader Celebrimbor. When they were completed, Sauron traveled to the fires of Mount Doom and made his masterwork, the One Ring of Power, one ring to rule them all. Believing this was the key to conquering Middle-earth, Sauron gave it immense power by imbuing it with part of his soul, thereby linking his life force to the One Ring. Placing this creation upon his finger, Sauron expected to gain mastery over the elves wearing the lesser rings, but they immediately felt his dark presence, removed them, and thereby resisted his influence. His plan of failure and identity exposed, the Dark Lord confronted the elves, demanding they surrender the rings. When they refused, the armies of Mordor slaughtered their people, capturing Celebrimbor as he fought a last stand alongside his warriors. Finding 9 rings of power, Celebrimbor revealed the location of the other 7, yet despite suffering excruciating torture, would not give up the final 3. Eventually he was shot full of arrows, and his corpse used as a banner for Sauron's army, when it fell upon Elrond and the elves of Lindon, sent by Gil-galad to reinforce Eregion. Unfortunately, they came too late, and would have also been massacred, if not for the dwarves of Durin's folk and the elves of Lorien, who attacked the enemy from behind, distracting them long enough for Elrond, his warriors, and the survivors of Eregion to retreat north. With their allies saved, the dwarves and elves pulled back into the Misty Mountains, behind a powerful gate which could not be breached. Having fought to honor their friendship with the elves of Eregion, Durin's folk also provided a safe harbor for any refugees who came to their mountain and helped them get into the east where they might settle in Lorien. For these acts of courage and loyalty, the dwarves paid a terrible price, as Sauron made Khazad-dûm a permanent target for the orcs, leading to many years of war and forcing them to largely remain isolated within the safety of their mountain for the rest of the age. Despite this setback, Sauron went ahead with a new plan, gifting the 16 lesser rings of power to 9 human kings and 7 dwarf lords, hoping their minds were more susceptible to his corruption. Though the dwarves proved too resilient and did not succumb to his will, the rings did contribute to their eventual downfall, as it made them increasingly greedy and reckless in their pursuit of wealth. Yet of all the children of Ilúvatar, none proved more susceptible to corruption than men, with the 9 ring-bearers becoming powerful sorcerers, who slowly turned into the Nazgûl, ringwraiths loyal to the Dark Lord. Although his prized creation failed to accomplish its original purpose, so much of Sauron was put into the One Ring, it became his focal point, augmenting his natural abilities to ensure he was as powerful as possible, while allowing him to survive any harm to his body or spirit, so long as the ring survived. But at the same time, should he be parted from it, he would weaken significantly, and were it destroyed, the Dark Lord would also perish. Leading the remnants of his army and the survivors of Eregion north, Elrond established the refuge Imladris, which soon became a great elven stronghold, with its leader named Vice-Regent of all Eriador, second only to King Gil-galad. Yet this new center of elven power was not enough to turn the tide of battle, and as the War of the Elves and Sauron continued, the Dark Armies conquered nearly all of the Westlands, save for Imladris and Mithlond, which were held under siege. Yet just as the Greyhavens were set to fall, the ships of Numenor came into the harbor, bringing forth a mighty host to drive the Dark Lord into retreat. Though Tar Telperion was reluctant to involve herself in the affairs of Middle-earth, her nephew and heir, Menastir, at once answered the call for reinforcements sent by Gil-galad and Lindon. Sending the commander Kiriatur with a vast army and fleet, he split their forces in two, sending half to defend the Greyhavens, chasing the enemy east to defeat them again at the Battle of Sarn Ford, while the rest of the Númenóreans landed at the mouth of the Gwathlo River, cutting off Sauron's retreat and defeating him once more. Finally, with his armies all but destroyed, the Dark Lord was attacked in the east of Kalinardan, left to flee back into Mordor, broken and humiliated. In the north, the Orc army surrounding Rivendell was trapped between the warriors of Elrond and Gil-galad, bringing the elves victory against the Dark Lord, though it came at a high cost, with many of their people killed and their lands utterly devastated. When Tar Menastir inherited the scepter from his aunt in 1731, he set out to secure western Middle-earth from further invasion by establishing permanent settlements, guarded by their ships and soldiers, which might work with their allies, the elves. However, his son Tar-Kiryatan had no love for the Eldar, and when he took charge in 1869, dedicated his reign to expanding their imperialist power, sending ships to sail and colonize every corner of the world, establishing coastal colonies which demanded tribute from the peoples of Middle-earth. It was under Tar-Kiryatan that Númenóreans started to deride the Valar, resenting them for the ban placed on sailing westward, as no mortal man was meant to set foot upon the Undying Lands. Though the Valar, Maiar, and Elves were all permitted to live in Valinor, upon the continent of Aman, experiencing the enchanted paradise for as long as they wished, mortal men were forbidden from traveling to these sacred lands. In the beginning, humans were happy to make their lives in the east, but in the later years of Númenórean power, some came to see it as an injustice that elves who once rebelled and left the Undying Lands were allowed to return, but the high men of Numenor who fought for the Valar in the War of Wrath were not permitted. To answer their questions, the Valar sent emissaries who explained that this world was the eternal home of the elves, and they were fated to experience its pleasures and weariness until the day of doom and end of all things. For this reason, they felt a special connection to the natural world and were invited to enjoy the paradise of the Undying Lands. Arda, however, was not the final home of men, as they had a second destiny awaiting them after death, a fate so secret none but the creator Eru knew what was to come. And so men lived only short lives of relative hardship in this world, and were not to voyage west, as they had another destiny awaiting them in the afterlife. Were they to travel to these forbidden lands, they would be attempting to claim both the gift of elves and men for themselves, and this Eru would not allow. Yet this explanation was not enough to placate the men of Numenor, who stated that awaiting a second destiny after death required great faith, as they could not be certain of Eru's intentions, while going west to the Undying Lands was something they could do within their lifetimes, and might bring them joy in this world, which they loved dearly. And so their anger and fear of death only worsened, shortening their extended lifespans, and pushing them into an imperialist mindset they used to expand and conquer the world. The hostility and pride of Numenor led the elves of the Undying Lands to stop visiting, and when Kiriatan's son, Tar Atanamir the Great, inherited the scepter in 2029, matters only grew worse, as he furthered their imperialist policies and vitriol against the Valar. Atanamir became the first king to refuse abdicating in his elder years, and instead ruled until his death in 2251, when he was succeeded by his son Tar Ankalaman. Under Ankalaman, those loyal to the growing imperialist mindset of Numenor began to heavily populate the colony of Umbar, while those who remained faithful to Eru, the Valar, and the Elves founded the city of Pelargir. In 2386, the king died and was succeeded by his son, Tar Telemaite, who was then followed by his daughter, Tar Vanemelde, in 2526. Throughout much of her reign, her husband ruled as regent, and so when she passed in 2637, he usurped power, taking the name Tar Andukal and ruling until his death 20 years later. Nevertheless, their history books did not count him as an official king, and so the next true ruler was his son, Tar Alcarin, who reigned until 2737, when his own son, Tar Kalmakil, inherited the scepter. Tar Kalmakil was the first king to record his name not only in the traditional Quenya of the Elves, but also their own language, Adunaik, calling himself Ar Balzagar. In 2825, his son Tar Ardaman took power, known also as Ar Abadarik, who was then replaced by his son in 2899, the first king to take the scepter with a title in the Adunaik language, rather than Quenya, named Ar Adunakor, meaning Lord of the West, an insult directed towards Manwe, king of the Valar, who shared the title. Under his rule, Quenya was forbidden in his presence, and only the faithful, led by the lords of Andunier, remained in contact with the elves. After the death of Ar Adunakor, his heir Ar Zimrathon inherited the scepter in the year 2962, followed by his son Ar Sakalthor in 3033 and Ar Gimilzor in 3102. Throughout these years, the corruption of the Numenorians deepened, and the Kingsmen faction grew so influential that by the reign of Ar Gimilzor, all elven languages were banned from Numenor, and spies were sent to watch the faithful, a small faction who continued to worship Eru. When Gimilzor learned that the faithful were using their western port city to remain in secret contact with the elves of Tol Eressëa, they were forcibly moved to the other side of the island, leading many to leave Numenor entirely and migrate to Pelargir in Middle-earth. Though other kings had spoken and acted against their ancient traditions, Ar Gimilzor was the first to never climb the mountain Meneltarma in reverence of Eru, and even neglected the white tree Nimloth, a gift from the elves, thought to be tied to the prosperity of the royal family. The white tree Nimloth and its ancestors had a history dating back to the years before the sun, when the white tree of light, Telperion, was destroyed by Morgoth during an attack against Valinor. In honor of this wondrous creation, Yavanna made a second tree in its image, Galathilion, and planted it in the city of Tirion. From Galathilion, a seedling was taken and planted in Tol Eressëa, sprouting the white tree Celeborn. The elves then took a seedling from Celeborn and gifted it to Numenor, where it became the white tree Nimloth, a profound symbol for their king and people. Though Ar Gimilzor married Inzilbeth, a woman renowned for her great beauty, their marriage was unhappy, as she was secretly one of the faithful and did not agree with her husband's actions and views. Their firstborn son, Inziladun, took after his mother and became one of the faithful, while their second child, Gimilcad, was like his father and became a leader of the Kingsmen. Though Ar Gimilzor wanted Gimilcad to succeed him, he was unable to change the law, and so when he died in 3177, his firstborn child inherited the scepter and immediately set to work, reversing the corruption which plagued their people. First, he took a Quenya name, Tar Palantir, then tended to the tree Nimloth, stopped persecuting the faithful, and ascended Meneltarma in reverence of Eru. Yet it was not enough to turn the tide that began centuries earlier, and many rebelled against his rule, turning to his brother Gimilcad, leader of the Kingsmen. Disheartened by the civil strife, Tar Palantir spent much of his time gazing upon the waters of the west, hoping to see a sign from the Valar, but no sign came, and when he died in 3255, so too did his reforms. Although his only child, a daughter Miriel, was raised as a faithful and might have ruled like her father, she lacked popular support, and so her cousin, the son of Gimilcad, staged a coup and forcibly married her to become Ar Pharazôn, the last ruler of Numenor, who reigned at the very height of its power. Meanwhile, in the lands of Middle-earth, the Dark Lord rebuilt his armies after failing to conquer the West in the War of the Elves and Sauron, and in time grew more powerful than ever, expanding his influence in the East and South. Inheriting the legacy of his ancient master, Sauron encouraged those who served Melkor in the past to continue seeing him as a deity, so the new Dark Lord could be viewed as the emissary or voice of their god. Arrogant in his power, Sauron underestimated the strength of the Dunedain and once again attempted to conquer the West, attacking Numenorian colonies. In his youth, Ar-Pharazôn served in these wars against Sauron, gaining much fame, prestige, and wealth from his adventures. Upon returning home, he was generous with his coin and won the loyalty of the people, allowing him to take leadership of the king's men after the death of his father, and used that support to usurp power for himself. Yet Sauron did not fear the king and sent his armies on a great campaign west, causing several Numenorian commanders to sail home and report that the Dark Lord of Mordor had taken a new title, calling himself the King of Men. Outraged by his proclamation, Ar-Pharazôn set out to claim the title for himself and spent several years preparing a mighty host to descend upon the east. When at last the Dark Lord's armies saw the full might of the Numenorian fleet sailing into the port of Umbar, they grew so fearful they deserted and fled, allowing Ar-Pharazôn and his men to march upon Mordor without opposition. Once arrived, Ar-Pharazôn called for Sauron to come forth and humble himself by swearing fealty. Realizing that he underestimated their power, the Dark Lord knew he was defeated in the short term, but also saw this as a unique opportunity to secure victory in the long term, and so devised a new plan to destroy his enemies from within. Taking fair form, Sauron presented himself before Ar-Pharazôn and bent the knee, accepting his defeat in words deemed fair and wise. Yet the king was unconvinced that Sauron would truly abide by his oath, and so after stripping him of all lands and titles, brought him to Numenor as a prisoner to ensure he could no longer pose a threat to their colonies on Middle-earth. Though Sauron acted disheartened by the decision, he was actually thrilled, as this was precisely what he wanted. Once in Numenor, Sauron worked hard to ingratiate himself with the royal court and population, using his vast knowledge and skills to help them however possible. Gaining their trust, he then formed the cult of Melkor, building a temple dedicated to the worship of the first Dark Lord, performing human sacrifices in his name. Because Sauron was a Maya, an immortal being older than the world itself, and the people already hated the lords of the West, many, including the king, believed Sauron's teachings, that the god of this world, Eru, did not exist, and the Valar invented him to keep humanity subjugated. But Melkor, the giver of freedom, wanted to liberate them from this oppression, and through his worship, men might become even more powerful than the Valar. Becoming an advisor to the king, Sauron's influence grew, and so he started calling for the white tree Nimloth to be destroyed, and in response, Isildur, one of the faithful and the grandson of Amandil, the lord of Andúnie, broke the law by stealing a fruit from the tree to safeguard its legacy. Unfortunately, this action was seen as a sign by the king, who then ordered Nimloth burned. Growing more stubborn and prideful by the day, Ar-Pharazôn dismissed the Lord of Andúnie from his council, a close friend since childhood, so beloved that despite being one of the faithful, he was allowed to serve in the royal court. Fortunately, while Amandil was no longer welcome in the capital, he was still highly respected, and no harm befell him or his family. Using the secret knowledge provided by the Dark Lord Sauron, Numenorians devised new engines and built greater ships, growing wealthy through their colonies in Middle-earth, which plundered and enslaved their neighbors, performing ritual sacrifices to honor their god Melkor. Yet their pursuit of material possessions and military power only furthered their corruption and fear of death, and the Dunedain began to lose the blessings bestowed upon them, suffering from madness, illness, and shorter lifespans. As they interacted with one another, they were increasingly greedy, jealous, angry, and violent, quarreling and killing each other over minor provocations. As the Dark Lord traveled throughout the island, he spread further hatred and stirred up rebellions against the nobility, which in turn caused the lords and king of the island to take cruel revenge upon the people. For years, Ar-Pharazôn ruled as the greatest tyrant since Morgoth in the First Age, though in truth, Sauron ruled from the shadows. Yet despite having everything a man could want, the king's fear of death intensified as he grew older, and ready to prey on this vulnerability, Sauron one day approached him to reveal yet another secret truth. Eager to begin the final stage of his plan, Sauron explained that the Lords of the West lied about the nature of their eternal lives, and that if a being as mighty as Ar-Pharazôn were to conquer the Undying Lands, he would gain immortality and rule the world in place of the Valar. For 9 years, Ar-Pharazôn prepared the Great Armament, planning the invasion of Valinor, and in response, signs were sent to warn them of their folly, like earthquakes, darkened skies, violent winds, torrential rain, hailstorms, and clouds in the shape of eagles, with lightning beneath their wings. Yet in the face of all this, Ar-Pharazôn remained defiant, claiming, "The lords of the West have plotted against us. They strike first, the next blow shall be ours." When at last the great armament was complete, a final warning fell upon them when the eagles of Manwë came forth, arrayed as if for battle, with a terrible red sky behind them, shining so bright the Numenorians glowed, as if lit with a flame of great anger. But the king ignored the omen and hardened his heart further, boarding his ship and sailing for war. As all this occurred, the Lord of Andúnië watched from afar, knowing that the king was bringing doom upon them all, and devised his own plan to save their people. Leaving his son Elendil in command, he sailed in secret to the Undying Lands, in hopes of replicating the success of his ancestor Eärendil, who convinced the Valar to save Middle-earth from Morgoth in the First Age. Though he knew it was dangerous to defy the ban of the Valar, he hoped that because his people remained faithful to Eru, he might yet convince them to save Numenor. Following his father's instructions, Elendil then prepared a fleet of ships at the port of Romena and readied the faithful to depart if necessary, taking with them as many island treasures as possible. To explain their actions, they claimed Amandil left to prepare a new home for their people in Middle-earth, and the other faithful were preparing ships to follow. Departing the island with his 3 most loyal servants, the Lord of Andúnië was never heard from again, and while the Valar once answered the call of a man in the First Age and saved the Edain, they would not do so a second time. With Amandil gone, Elendil was called by the king to bring his warriors forth and join the Great Armament, but he refused, and so after the ships departed, Sauron sent his soldiers against the faithful, who retreated to their ships and sailed eastward, waiting to see what was to come. In the year 3319 of the Second Age, Ar-Pharazôn and his mighty fleet arrived in the Undying Lands, finding it haunted by an eerie silence as the elves who lived along the coast pulled back to a nearby city. Though the king hesitated and wavered, nearly turning back at the last moment, his pride would not allow it, and so he marched into Valinor and declared himself ruler of the continent, before ordering his men to make camp around Tirion. In response to the High Men of Numenor ignoring their warnings, violating the ban, and invading their homeland with weapons of war, Manwë, king of the Valar, called upon their creator, Eru, who unleashed his terrible power, causing Numenor to fall beneath the waves, and the Undying Lands to physically detach itself from the world. As all this occurred, the ships of the Great Armament were swallowed by the sea, while Ar-Pharazôn and his warriors were buried beneath falling hills, trapped within the Forgotten Caves, until the final battle at the end of the world. In later years, when men once again began sailing west, hoping to find the fabled land of Aman, or else the remains of Numenor, they failed to do so, and instead reported that all roads are now bent, meaning their once flat world was now round, and populated with new lands and seas. Yet while the mortal races could no longer travel to the Undying Lands, a hidden, straight road remained, accessible only to the elves, though some humans told stories of great mariners who stumbled upon this secret path and were able to glimpse the shores of Valinor before they died. While Eru reshaped the world, the people of Numenor were destroyed, including their queen, the faithful Midiel, who died trying to escape the waves by climbing Meneltarma, her dying screams lost in the roaring winds. Though Sauron was fearful when he felt the fury of Eru, it soon turned to mirth, laughing at the ruin he brought upon his enemies. When his temple finally collapsed and his body died, the Maya spirit within emerged, still in possession of the One Ring of Power, and made its way to Middle-earth and his home of Mordor. Having lost the ability to take fair form, Sauron made himself a body to inspire fear, and started rebuilding his armies to once again conquer Middle-earth. Yet the peoples of the West continued to oppose him, not only the elves, who under King Gil-galad grew mighty during the years of the Dark Lord's absence, but also Elendil, son of Amandil, and his followers the faithful of Numenor, who survived the doom. Standing aboard their ships as the world changed around them, the faithful saw their island home collapse into the sea before the tempest overtook them. Though it cannot be certain why they were spared, some believe Amandil's voyage to the Undying Lands was not entirely in vain, and for his sake, the Valar protected the faithful from the terrible storms, and brought them unharmed to the shores of Middle-earth. With their ships split into two groups, Elendil and his followers sailed into the kingdom of Lindon and were greeted warmly by the Elven king, while Isildur and Anarion arrived at the mouth of the river Anduin. In the north, they established the kingdom of Arnor, populated with settlements like Anuminas, Fornost, Cardolan, and Rudaur, while in the south, they formed the kingdom of Gondor, with the brother kings ruling from the capital of Osgiliath, though Minas Ithil was the home of Isildur, and Minas Anor was the home of Anarion. Though the scepter of the king was lost when Ar-Pharazôn attacked Valinor, the faithful were able to save the scepter of Andúnië, which was then held by the kings of Arnor, as well as many other Númenórean treasures, like the 7 Palantiri gifted by the elves, stones which allowed the user to see and communicate over great distances, with those of great power able to use them to see almost anything. The faithful also saved the white tree growing from the seedling of Nimloth, and it was planted in Minas Ithil with Isildur and his people. Furious that his Númenórean enemies survived and were prospering in the west, Sauron launched his attack earlier than originally planned, and descended upon Minas Ithil, burning the white tree and forcing Isildur into retreat, though he was once again able to save a seedling before departing to seek reinforcements. The Dark Armies also attacked Osgiliath, but Anarion led the defense and held his ground, though it was clear they could not last much longer. Learning of the attacks, King Elendil met with King Gil-galad and formed the last alliance of men and elves, gathering the largest army assembled since the War of Wrath to engage Sauron's forces at the Battle of Dagorlad, where it seemed as though all the races and beasts of Middle-earth were represented on both sides, save for the elves, who fought entirely in opposition to the Dark Lord. Fighting for the last alliance was King Elendil with the Dunedain of Arnor, the kings Anarion and Isildur with the Dunedain of Gondor, King Gil-galad and Lord Elrond with the Noldor and Sindar elves of Lindon and Imladris, as well as King Amdir and King Orofer with the Sylvan elves of Lothlorien and the Woodland Realm. Fighting for the Dark Lord were orcs, trolls, wicked beasts, and men of the east and south, both those who served him in Morgoth in the past, and the Black Númenóreans, who now populated the coasts, Dunedain, who were in the colonies and therefore survived the doom of their island. While some of those colonists were faithful, like those in Pelargir, the Black Númenóreans of the south were kingsmen and easily won to the side of Sauron. Among these recruits were the men of Umbar, as well as Herumor and Fuinur, who became great lords of the Haradrim. Though few dwarves participated in the war, some served Sauron, while the Longbeards of Durin's folk emerged from their mountain to join the last alliance. Though the Battle of Dagorlad was won by the free peoples of Middle-earth, it was a devastating conflict, made worse because the Sylvan elves did not feel any particular loyalty to the Sindar and Noldor of the west, and therefore disobeyed orders and attacked prematurely, resulting in the death of King Orofer, while Amdir and half his army were slaughtered in what came to be called the Dead Marshes. Despite winning the battle, the war was not over, and so the Alliance entered Mordor and laid siege to Barad-dûr. For 7 years, the Dark Lord mounted an impressive defense, peppering them with projectiles and raids, resulting in significant casualties, including the death of King Anarion. But in the end, Sauron finally emerged, prepared to face his enemies directly. Answering his challenge, the kings Elendil and Gil-galad fought valiantly and gave their lives to slay the Dark Lord. With all three fallen, Elendil's last surviving son, Isildur, picked up the shards of Narsil, his father's broken sword, and cut the One Ring of Power from Sauron's finger, destroying his physical body. However, Sauron's spirit survived as it was linked to the One Ring, and so both Elrond and Círdan urged Isildur to destroy it in the fires of Mount Doom. But the corruption of the ring and the allure of its power led him to keep it as Wergild for the loss of his father and brother. With the death of Gil-galad, the Noldor kingdoms of Middle-earth were at an end, and so many decided to leave and return to the Undying Lands. Of the elves who remained behind, some lived in the Grey Havens under Círdan, or else Imladris under Elrond, Lothlorien under Amdir's son Amroth, and the Woodland Realm under Orofer's son Thranduil. The Dunedain lived under Isildur as king of Gondor and Arnor, while Durin's folk returned to Khazad-dûm, and the servants of Sauron scattered into the east and south. Defeated but determined to have his revenge upon the free peoples of Middle-earth, the Dark Lord slowly recovered and made new plans, awaiting the day he might return to full strength by reuniting with the One Ring of Power. A special thanks to all those who contribute to CivilizationEx, like youtube.com/soulguidemedical, Lord Tarax Zoron, Ty Gillian Fraser, and Fred Heartless, Knight of Iron and Ice. If you'd like to help CivilizationEx, click on the Patreon link, and please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to see more.